We'll go ahead and get started and introduce our speaker. Shannon Matzke is going to present today. She has been with us since September as the Georgia SeaGrant Fellow, and she's been working with the Coastal Management Program on some of our green growth initiatives. She's from Louisiana, where she got her bachelor's degree in coastal environmental science, and then recently in December finished up her master's degree in biology from Georgia Southern University. And she actually is presenting on part of her thesis work there, which was also funded as a coastal incentive grant from our office. So with that, please join me in welcoming Shannon.
All right. Thanks, Kelly, and thanks everybody for coming. This is a lot of people. It's really nice of you. So, like you just heard, my name is Shannon Matzke, and I'm the SeaGrant State Fellow here at CRD. But the work that I'm going to be talking about today was part of my master's thesis at Georgia Southern, which I just finished up in December. So my project took place on Tybee Island, where I was measuring plant growth, sand accretion, and implications for management on a new dune that was built out there in 2020. So like Kelly said, this work was part of a coastal incentive grant project. And it was funded for 2 years by the Coastal Management Program. And I was working with my advisor in the biology department at Georgia Southern, Lissa Leahy, and the city of Tybee Island to do the work that I'm going to talk about today. And we were funded for a 2-year project. So I'm going to be talking about the year 1 part of that project. That was from October 2020 to October 21. And we're currently in year 2. So there is more to come from this project. And in year 1, we had 2 main tasks that I'll be talking about today. And the first one is the dune monitoring. So the dune monitoring is what I was doing for my thesis. And some of the deliverables that came out of this was a final report for the Coastal Management Program, my master's thesis, along with different presentations, and then a best management practice brochure so that I can share the conclusions that I've come to with other coastal managers. So to start, I'm going to talk a little bit about sand dunes. So you probably all have an idea in your mind of what a sand dune is, something tall, made of sand, on a beach, full of some grasses, which is correct, but there's actually a much broader definition of sand dunes. So what you're thinking of is definitely a dune, but also any area landward of an active beach where there are dune grasses present can be considered a dune. And this knowledge is really important for management because when you see a sign that might say, keep off the dunes, it's important to know what exactly that means, that it's not just the big structures that you see, it's also an area where maybe there's a couple of sea oats that is starting to build sand. And when we have these dune grasses, they are building sand, and that can become a dune. So it's important to understand exactly what a sand dune is if we're going to talk about how to manage and how to restore them. So dunes are really important out on our coast because they protect coastal ecosystems and development. Dunes are really important when we have hurricanes, storms, and even just high tides along the coast. And specifically, the vegetation on dunes is really vital to those dunes' functions. So vegetation has been shown to provide 30 to 40% more of a reduction of erosion than just bare sand. So when you have a dune, the vegetation is really important to make sure that it's doing its job. Plenty of studies have found this, and in fact, they're valued really highly during these storms. When there's vegetation, that vegetation is valued at $150 per meter cubed during damaging storms. So they really provide a lot for us. And I have this graphic here, it's from SeaGrant et al. 2014, that's showing why plants are important on sand dunes. So I'm going to get out of the way somehow. All right, so plants have many things about them. So I'm going to start with what happens above ground. So these above ground interactions are things that happen with the plant's shoots, stems, leaves. And this is important for wave energy dissipation. So when, gosh, it got really quiet now. When there is waves from storms or anything like that, a plant's height, its amount of flexibility, and the cover of the plant can help to dissipate that wave energy. And also, these above ground structures start to build sand. So there's this positive feedback loop that happens on our sand dunes in the above ground portions of plants. So when a plant on a dune is covered by sand, it starts to grow more. And then these taller plants are able to pick up more sand. So as sand is blowing in the wind, coming in from the beach, the sand or the plants can trap that sand and continue to build the dunes. So we have this really wonderful positive feedback loop. But there's a whole other world that these plants have beneath the soil surface. So the plant's roots are just as important as all those above ground structures. So the plants have these really dense, deep roots out on the dunes, and this helps to hold the sand in place. So it's not enough just to have a tall dune, you need something stable so that when hurricane winds do come in, the sand dune doesn't break. You wanna make sure that you have plenty of roots in your dunes so that those dunes can hold up and really perform the functions that are needed to protect the coast. But it's not just about us, it's about natural communities out on the beach too. So sand dunes are a really important habitat here on the coast. I'm going to talk specifically about sea turtles, but there's plenty of other animals, shorebirds, insects, other types of fauna that use these dunes. But our loggerhead sea turtles, they nest in bare sand or patches of grass. So this is a loggerhead nest out on Tybee last summer. And when turtles nest, a little bit of elevation is really useful so that they can get out of the tidal range, because if a nest is inundated, then there's a chance that those eggs won't be able to make it and hatch. And then also a little bit of grass can help to protect against predators, provide a little bit of cover. And then also we've probably all heard about, turning your lights out during turtle nesting season, because turtles need to orient themselves to the water. Once they hatch, they have to make it out to the water. But artificial light can make it harder for these hatchlings to know where to go, and they might crawl the wrong way. But if there's a consistent amount of dunes on the beach, then that helps to block out some of that artificial light. And so it's really useful for turtles to find their way out to the ocean. So dunes are important for us and for the animals that live out on our beaches. But like many ecosystems right now, coastal dunes are under threat of rising sea levels. So this is a chart of sea level rise from Fort Pulaski, which is the nearest tide gauge to my project out on Tybee. And we see that over the last century, there's been about 3 millimeters per year of sea level rise. And that's on par with national averages. So what this is telling us is that our coastline, it is at threat. It's at risk of being inundated by this rising sea level. And Tybee has experienced this rise in sea level for a while now. And for many years, Tybee has been in the process of nourishing their beaches. So using offshore dredged sand, they've been widening these beaches on a cycle. The cycle has been happening, or it's about a 7-year cycle, where Tybee has to go and nourish their beach. Mostly they do it for tourism, because when people visit a beach, they want a nice wide beach. They don't want something that's been eroding and there's not a lot of space. But this cycle has been getting shorter and shorter as there's been devastating hurricanes out on our coast. So instead of 7 years, Tybee's finding themselves needing to nourish their beach more often. So they decided in 2020 to, rather than simply add sand to the beach, to actually build up their dunes, because there was areas of the island where there were no sand dunes at all. So anytime the water would come in, it could flood streets, it would go up to people's homes. So they decided to nourish the beach and build a series of sand dunes and plant them. So this is some drone footage. Hopefully it's not too seasick for anybody. Some drone footage of Tybee's dune construction. So this happened in early 2020, and these plants were all added in by a plant nursery from Florida. This is 6 different species of native dune plants. And this is the area of the island that I did my study on. So here I'm showing you a before and after drone image of Tybee's beach. So on the left, this is from 2019, and this is before the most recent nourishment and dune construction. So in comparison with the February photo, you can see that the beach has gotten much wider and that there's this whole addition of sand dunes. So in 2019, in this area of Tybee, this is in the center of the island, there were no dunes here at all. So you can imagine that as the tide would come in, or if a storm came in, it would hit this street, it would hit all of these buildings right here. So having this sand dune is really important. And what you're seeing, all these little dots, that's all of the plants that were added, and then right in front is a line of sand fencing that was installed to just accumulate even more sand. So this is just, you can really tell when you see the before and after drone images how much of a difference this project made out on the beach. So where do I come in? Tybee was already doing this project. I didn't have anything to do with the dune construction, but what I wanted to do was come in and help Tybee monitor, because they didn't have any way to know how successful their project would be. So my role in this is to determine the success. So the first thing that I wanted to do during my project was to determine the native plant community of Tybee's dunes. Native plants are really important for this ecosystem, so I wanted to know what was even out there, and then also figure out if these plants were able to colonize onto these new dunes. We want to know if we build a dune, if we add plants, will more come in, or are we going to have to do it all ourselves? So that was my first objective. And then the next objective is simply monitoring. I wanted to evaluate the survival of these plants and then look at the growth of vegetation and how much sand was either accumulating or eroding off of these dunes. And then I conducted an experiment to determine the effects of planting density. So there's different best management practices for different areas of the country as far as how many plants you want to add on a dune, how close they should be, what species. But we wanted information specific to Tybee, because our barrier islands are different than islands in other areas, and Tybee is even different from adjacent islands. So it was important to know what density of plants was most effective for our project. And then finally, I was interested in seeing if there was any way to predict the amount of sand accretion that was happening out on these dunes. So, is it the height of a plant? Is it how many plants you add? Is it how large the plants are? Like, how can we know, how can we get a good prediction of how much sand is accumulating on these dunes? Those are my 4 main objectives going into this project. And like I said, my project's on Tybee. This area in the center of the island is my study sites. So this was one of their constructed dunes. Tybee did a couple of different dune constructions. I focused in just one area. And then along this area, I had different sites going along the dunes with different experimental treatments. So these blue dots here, these are my reference sites. So just adjacent to the constructed dune, there were some pre-existing dunes that I could use as a reference and as a control to see what was happening just on the island already. And then my red dots are for areas of the dune that we planted with vegetation. And then I also left a couple areas bare, which are these yellow sites. And that was another control. So what happens if you build a dune, don't plant anything, just to see what would happen in that situation. And I've also added photos of the 6 different plant species that Tybee chose to add. A lot of the planting is dependent on what the nursery has. So Tybee's project included hundreds of thousands of plants, and not many nurseries can accommodate that sort of thing. So a lot of this is just, we can give you this many of this plant, and then we just kind of have to go down the line and see what's available. So one of the species was sea oats, which is the most common species on coastal dunes in Georgia. You've probably all seen it. It's pretty iconic with their summer inflorescences. We also planted Spartina patens, which is commonly seen in our coastal marshes. We planted bitter panic grass, which I've seen more in southern Georgia, so out on Jekyll and St. Simons, but Tybee planted this one as well, and it has pretty similar function to sea oats. We planted muley grass, which is often used in landscaping. It's another native grass. We also planted a shrub, the seacoast marsh elder, and we planted one vine, and this is beach morning glory. And morning glory was a good plant to add to all of these grasses because the way that it grows, it just spreads all the way across the dunes. So you can imagine that all of those roots are really helping to stabilize these dunes. So those are the 6 species that Tybee chose to plant on their new dunes. And I, like I said, had different sites along this dune. So I had 24 sites of planted dune vegetation, and this vegetation was planted in a range of densities, so anywhere from 2 to 9 plants per meter squared. And in this drone image, it's a little hard to see, but I've highlighted a higher density section and a lower density section, just to give you an idea of what that range looks like. And then I've also highlighted one of the bare sites. So these sites were they were a strip of the whole dune, and they were 30 feet wide. And then I had the sites on the pre-existing dune. And to collect my data, I started 1 month after the plants went in the ground. So I started in June of 2020, and I collected data monthly on plant growth and survival throughout the first summer, came back again in spring, and started monthly collections again. So I didn't collect during the dormant season. However, I did collect data on accretion during the entire 15-month period. So every month, I would come out and measure whether there was accretion or erosion on these dunes so that I could get a cumulative number by the end of the study. So breaking it down a little bit more, I had these permanent meter square plots out in the dunes, and I would come back and measure the growth of each individual plant. So I looked at leaf height, stem density, percent cover, and survival of plants. And then on a meter square basis, I looked at canopy cover and then my measurements of accretion. And this was a pretty interesting measurement. So at the bottom here, you can see these small wooden dowels. These were permanently placed into the sand at a certain level. So each month when I would come back, I could get a measure of accretion or erosion based on how it looked last month. And this allowed for that cumulative measurement. And having this fine scale data is pretty cool for this sort of project because we have plenty of technology that can give us these accretion and erosion rates, but usually the measure or the error measure of it is so large that the measurements that I was seeing out there would be within the level of error. So even if you're doing this large-scale study, you might have seen no change out on these dunes because that change was so small. You really need to be on the ground to understand what is happening out there on this short period of time. So now I'll get into some of the things that I found. So the first thing I want to talk about is survivorship of all of these plants. So this chart is showing the percent of each species on the dunes that survived over the whole study. So at the beginning of the study, 100% survival because they had all just gone into the ground, and then until July of 2021. So over 2 growing seasons, how had these plants done? And what we see is that overall, there was a 97% survival rate of all of the plants, which was pretty much unheard of for this sort of project. So our planters came in and they guaranteed 85% survival, which is already a lot. They're saying that below 85%, they would come back in and add more plants at no cost. And they didn't have to do that, and there wouldn't have even been space for them to come back because these plants did so well. Most studies find 60 to 75% survival. So things are looking good right from the start for Tybee. The plants at least survive, which is really the first step of any sort of planting project. So that was great news. And what I want to show you here is just how much these plants have grown out on the dunes. So this is all just from the first growing season. So this is the exact same meter square plot from June 2020, so 1 month after the plants went into the ground, to September 2020. So you can see here, these are 2 panic grass plants. By the end of the summer, they had more than doubled in size, and this one right here had even flowered. So when these plants went into the ground, they were like tiny 2-inch plugs. And so the fact that they were already flowering at the end of the summer was really a surprise, and it's showing that these dunes are gonna fill in very quickly. So let's jump into the data a little bit. This is looking at plant growth over time. So here are two graphs showing canopy cover and then height or leaf height of these plants from the beginning to the end of the study. And remember, I didn't take any data during the dormant season, so that's why there is a break in the data. But we're looking at the planted treatment and the reference treatment. Planted is this solid line, and the reference is this dotted line. And what we're seeing in both cases of growth is that right at the beginning, the reference dunes had larger plants, which makes sense because the plants went into the ground and they were tiny versus the reference dune where they had an established plant ecosystem. However, by the end of the study, there was no difference in the size of the plants on the planted versus the reference dunes. So that was a really exciting thing to find, that these dunes, after just 2 growing seasons, had already started to look like and even rival the size of the individual plants on the reference dune. And so there's a lot going on here, but I'll break it down for you. So now I'm looking at the density of plants and how that affects growth. So we've seen that the plants are growing pretty well, but now let's look at how close together do these plants need to be? How far apart do they need to be? And planting density is really important because these projects are very expensive. It already costs a lot just to dredge the sand to build the dunes. And then if each plant is about $1 and you're planting hundreds of thousands of them, that's going to add up. So if we can figure out how many plants we need on the dunes to make sure that they're doing their job, but it's not too much, that we're perhaps spending money that's unnecessary or planting too many and crowding them out. That's really important to know. So down here are examples of 1 plant per meter squared, 3, 5, and 9, just so you can see what that looks like. And then what we see is that there is a decrease in canopy cover, leaf height, and number of stems as we get denser, which makes sense. If you plant too many plants close together, there is more competition for resources, there's shading, so the plants won't be able to grow as much as if they had more space. But what we do see is that there's a bit of variation on either side of these boxes. So this box is right around 4 to 6 plants per meter squared, and this seems to be a sweet spot. So a lot of other best management practices have suggested planting in about this range, right around 5 plants per meter squared. So that's just something to think about, that it does seem to be decreasing, but it's really hard to predict when there are more or less plants than this. But we do see that too many plants is not beneficial for growth out on the dunes. Now I'm going to talk about importance values, and this is a pretty niche ecology topic, so bear with me. But importance values is a measure of relative frequency and abundance. So it's showing the dominance of a plant species. So what I've done is identified all of the plants that were present both on the new dunes and the reference dunes, and I assigned an importance value to all of them. And what we see is that in both cases, Uniola paniculata, which is sea oats, is the most important plant species. Really not surprising. If you go out and just take a look, you could probably guess that yourself. And by far, they're much higher values than any of the other plants. These are the 6 plants that were planted by Tybee out on the dunes. And then in the reference dunes, the only plant chosen by Tybee to plant that was present already in these dunes was Ipomoea, which is that morning glory vine, which was the 2nd most important species on the reference dunes. So just an interesting thing to see that these other plants weren't found on those dunes. One thing to note, though, these 3 species, they were all found on the constructed dunes, but they weren't planted there. So what that is showing us is that there is facilitation happening from these other plants. They're allowing species to come in and colonize. So if you plant a dune, it's showing that you don't necessarily have to plant everything you want there. There is room for other plants to colonize on their own. So that was another interesting thing to see, that these 3 native species have been starting to colonize the existing or the new dunes, which we really want. We want these new dunes to look as similar to the reference dunes as possible, because Tybee does still have some good dunes out there, but it's going to take a little bit of time before these new, very consistent dunes start to look like what's already out there. So that was the end of the plant growth things. Now I'm going to talk about sand accretion, which is sand accumulation. So one of the most important things is to figure out, are these dunes growing? Sometimes you can, or not sometimes, I don't know what I'm saying, but when you build a dune, it's really, it's a dynamic system. So these dunes can grow, they can shrink, and we want them to grow. Tybee put a lot of money into this, and we want to make sure that these dunes are building on themselves. So what I'm showing you here is cumulative accretion over the whole period of the study, and then the 3 different treatments, so the bare dunes, the planted dunes, and the reference dunes. And what we're seeing is that there is a difference in accretion between all 3 of these treatments, and that these bare dunes, the newly constructed dunes that didn't have any plants on them, they had the smallest amount of accretion. It was essentially 0. Which that's interesting in itself. We were definitely expecting to see a little bit more erosion from these, dunes of sand with no plants on them. But the question is, even if they're not eroding, are they stable? If a hurricane comes through, are they going to be there, or is that going to be a blowout in the dune? So we're seeing, we don't know because we haven't had one. Hopefully not, but we know that they definitely aren't accreting sand as much as the planted dunes, which are accreting a little bit less than the reference dunes, but it's a pretty similar number. And I think that as the plants continue to grow on these new dunes, that they eventually will start to have a similar accretion rate as what we're seeing already on Tybee. So my next question was, can we predict accretion? Is there a way to say, we'll do this and we'll get this many centimeters of accretion? So to figure this out, I ran a model with all of the different data that I had collected over the study. And doing this, I found that the most accurate measure of accretion was simply looking at planting density, so plants per meter squared. So doing a regression of plants per meter squared and accretion, we see that the more plants, the more accretion you get. There is a positive trend here, and this is significant. However, just like with plant growth, as you plant more plants, the data are spread more, so it's harder to actually make those predictions. So what I think is interesting here is that the area with the most confidence is right in the middle at around 5 plants per meter squared. So you can see definitely things are going up here, but perhaps, higher than this, it's harder to predict what's happening. So that 5 plants per meter squared, that's also beyond which we saw more of a decrease in plant growth. And this is also the number that other studies have found to be successful on their dunes. So what does this all mean for management? Well, first of all, it's really important to consider the goals of your project. So Tybee is unique in the barrier island dynamics, and also their goals were specific. They wanted a dune that would hold in place if there was another large hurricane. But that might not be the goal of other communities. They might want more habitat value. They might worry more about the cost of the project. So in anything you're doing, it's always important to consider those goals. Next, though, was our recommendation for planting density. So this is where the 45 centimeter spacing comes from. This is equivalent to about 5 plants per meter squared. So that was successful in this case, and that does seem to be generally a good recommendation for Tybee and other areas along the coast. But again, it'll depend on the goals of your project. It's important to choose species that will facilitate colonization and that will provide different functions. So having a mix of species with above ground biomass and below ground biomass is really important for a tall and stable dune. And then finally, that nature-based solutions are economical and they're popular with the public. And the more we tell people about the success of this project, I think the more confident they will be in something like a dune going in front of their home that might take away from their view a little bit, but that they'll realize is important for protection during the next storm. And the only way to get this information out is to disseminate it in different ways. So through the Coastal Incentive Grant and other funding, I've presented at different local, regional, state, national conferences. This was at the climate conference over the summer. And it's been really great to get the word out about the project on Tybee and also these best management practices that we're working to come up with for different areas of the coast. We also have created a brochure. So my advisor, Alyssa Leahy, and I have partnered with a graphic design student at Georgia Southern, Sydney Pycook, to create this sand dune vegetation brochure. This was funded by the Coastal Incentive Grant. And we're really excited for this because we really want it to have broad applications. So the point of this is to be able to give to residents of Tybee, visitors on Tybee, coastal managers, people who are interested in dunes, who want to know more, for students, so that they can understand the projects that's happening on Tybee and why dunes are important, along with some of those, the results from our study. So we have this completed and we're working on getting that printed so we can start handing out to anyone who has questions about this project and how it's applicable to other areas. So to finish up, I'll talk about the education and outreach that has been part of our Coastal Incentive Grant. Through the grant, we have engaged with stakeholders, provided social media content, and worked to recruit volunteers to help us with the monitoring. My part of the project is over, but there's still so much more data that we want to collect and learn. Any ecological restoration needs long-term monitoring if you're truly going to understand its success. And 2 summers out on a sand dune, which is a dynamic environment, does give us some good information, but it's not enough to fully understand the success of the restoration project. So Alyssa and I presented at a Tybee City Council meeting. We've also presented to the Tybee Beach Task Force to make sure that everyone who's involved in those decision-making processes understands what's going on out there, what we're finding, and what we're doing out there. We've also provided social media content to Tybee. So this was from a really fun day. Students at research experience for undergrads at Georgia Southern. So from all over the country, they came out to Tybee and helped us plant lots of little sea oats out in some areas that had been trampled, some crossovers, some areas that just we wanted them to be a little bit more narrow. And this got really good press. The news came out. I did an interview. It was nuts. But that was a really fun day, and so it's really good to get the word out about that. And we've also provided content about the specific plants, the project itself, what we're doing out there, making sure that people know that we're not just walking on the dunes, that we have a purpose out there when we're out. And we've also had students from Georgia Southern consistently come and help us with our monitoring. So this is one of the classes that has come out to Tybee. We always give them an introduction to coastal ecology and history of restoration on Tybee. And then they have helped us collect some accretion data along these sand fences. This is a question that researchers have been looking at, how much these sand fences actually help to accumulate sand. But again, if we're able to get there and get that on the ground, like small scale data, then that's really going to be helpful moving forward to know what these sand fencing areas can do. And they've also helped us look at the survivorship of other plants. So Tybee has built multiple dunes, they've planted multiple dunes, and I was just looking at one of them. So these students are coming and they're helping us to know how our dunes are comparing with others, seeing if what we're finding is consistent. And what's really great about this is that we're developing a monitoring protocol. So every time students come out, we're able to figure out what's important to learn so that in the future we can consistently have volunteers come out and continue to study these dunes and see what's going on with them. So I have a lot of people to thank for this project. My advisor, Lissa, my master's committee and all the professors who helped, Sydney for the brochure. We had a lot of help in the field over the 2 summers, and then we were funded by Georgia Southern through the Grad Student Organization and ICPS, CRD through the Coastal Incentive Grant, and SeaGrant from a research traineeship that I did with them last year. And I have my contact information at the bottom of the screen. And thanks everybody for coming out and enjoying your lunch with me. You can clap now.
All right, thank you, Shannon.
You're welcome, Kelly.
Does anyone have any questions? We're going to use the microphone if so just let me know.
So I am dying to know what your conversations were like with the city of Tybee when you were planning the project. Specifically, did they have any input on the density of the plants in terms of were there levels of risk that they did not want you to go above or below? Because you were after the science and the measurements, but did they have an impact in the study in terms of, well, you can study that, but we want to make sure we don't go below this level just for science and it not have a return on our investment?
Yes, a bit. When I asked them not to plant their sand dunes, that was a bit of a conversation because that was the whole point of the project. But they did let me do a couple areas with no plants. But as far as just low density, they were really supportive of it because they were interested too in the potential of both saving money and making it, getting the data from it and making sure that what we were doing was scientifically accurate. But they were really on board with the study, and their original plan had been 12 to 24-inch spacing, which most of what I did was right around that, maybe a little bit more or less. But it was really those bare sites that was a lot of conversation. And I believe the plan is to go back and plant those bare sites now that my study's over to make sure that there is no dune blowout from me trying to figure out if there would be or not.
I think I know this, but was all of the sand for the constructed dunes from the dredge? Was it dredged out from?
Yes.
Okay. Do you know if there's been any other studies? Did you do any research into sand coming from upland sources and if it would perform the same?
I did not, but I do know that the first dune that they built out there in November 2019 was from an upland source. The Army Corps is the one who has taken the lead on these projects in the past, and that'll be changing in the future, but they were ready to build a dune. The Corps wasn't ready to dredge, so Tybee took matters in their own hand and did get upland sand. So we haven't been studying that one, but definitely something to look into. That one has been, they built the dune from upland sources, but they didn't plant it, and that one has actually filled in really well already. So that'll be an interesting next step for somebody else.
Did you have study plots on both the seaward
Yes.
slope and the landward slope?
Yeah.
And did you see any difference
Yes,
between those?
I didn't add that in here because I already had a lot of information. But yes, this wasn't my whole master's thesis. This was just kind of the meat of it. But so I had 3 different zones of planting. So I had about from the toe of the dune to about halfway up the crest. And then the crest, so these dunes were fairly flat. They were much more consistent than existing dunes. And then I looked at the landward side of the dune, and I found that the seaward piece did experience the most sand accumulation. And at first I thought that was because of the sand fencing, but I found that it was also true in the reference dunes where those fences were not installed. So the crest and the back of the dune had similar levels of accretion, but the front definitely had the most. And that's likely because as sand is blowing in, it'll hit those first plants and most of it will drop down there. So studies have also shown and practices have suggested that when you're planting, you want to space plants less densely in the front of the dune and then more in the back so that there's still sand available as it blows across the dune to get trapped by the more dense plants on the back. We did not study all of that, but that is what the research shows.
I apologize if I missed it because I came in a little bit late. Did you compare accretion with sand fencing compared to vegetation, or is there, or just from your research, are there predictable accretion rates with sand fencing as opposed to vegetation?
I did not look at the sand fencing. That's stuff that volunteers have been doing, but other researchers have looked at the sand fencing, and so it's Clark Alexander, and he's found that there is more accretion going on with the fencing than what is happening on the dunes. And if you go out there, that's pretty obvious. These fences keep needing to be raised because they're building so much sand. But there is still sand available for the dunes themselves, just not catching quite as much as those fences.
Anyone else? All right. Well, thank you all so much for joining us, and
Thanks,
thank
guys.
you again, Shannon.
You're welcome.